You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic. I'm Cameron Lalana, and today, on For Your Consideration, we are doing something a little bit different. So I think I've talked about it on a couple other podcasts, but I recently have been going through a gauntlet of weddings, which I just wrapped up, and that has meant a lot of travel, a lot of time in hotels, and I should have been reading Sasha Sokolov's Between Dog and Wolf, but that book requires a fair amount of mental presence, which is something I lack when I'm tired and traveling and attending a lot of events. So instead, I read John Williams' Butcher's Crossing, and I have some thoughts. So that is what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to the Southwest Passage Pod. Much like Joseph Stalin, I'm a big fan of Westerns, and I have been since I was a kid. In fact, I was so into Westerns when I was young that for a while my dad made a point to watch one with me every week, which is something some memories I still hold on to really fondly. That was mostly movies. I mean, when I got a little older, I started reading some novels as well, but I was really mostly in it for the movies. And like, I probably watched The Magnificent Seven, the original one, more times than I can count. I couldn't even guess, honestly. And for most of my life, I was a pretty uncritical consumer of those Westerns, which is not to say that I didn't think about them, but I was more interested in specific themes, actually more like one specific theme, the end of the Wild West. And that theme could go a lot of different ways. In like books like Stephen King's Dark Tower series or in The Magnificent Seven, those to me, those are about the end of the West in spirit. Whereas Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the Old West, for me, he was a bit closer to the truth, which is that the Wild West, which, by the way, only lasted for about 30 years between the Civil War and a little before the turn of the 20th century, it was actually killed by trains. Settlers from the east, cities, towns, the chopping block of manifest destiny meeting the iron guillotine of capital. And that was, frankly, as far as I got for analysis, though. Over the years, I stopped reading, stopped watching, not because I had anything against it, but other things caught my attention, especially Slavic literature. And years later in college, I'd read Frederick Turner's Frontier Thesis, learn more about the original peoples of the Americas, and then I did start to appreciate how propagandistic that this genre is. But when I say that, I knew that kind of generally. Like, I could wave in the direction of a Louis L'Amour novel or any given John Wayne film, and I could say something like about the fantasies in it, the fantasies of masculinity, or the fantasy of single-handedly conquering some kind of wild land where, no one is, or if there are people there, then, I'm in the right, I'm the good guy, so I can go out and shoot them down because I'm taming this land. But I that would be like more of a criticism of the genre. I wouldn't really be able to articulate specifics that well about particular works. So I mostly didn't. Of all the things I harangued, Westerns is not really one of them. If I spoke about them at all, it would be to talk about that idea of the end. And Wild West or anywhere else, I do like exploring the end of things. So I guess it's really not that special. It's just kind of an interesting thing to tie together. But that did change for me a bit when I read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian a few years back. And if you're not familiar, Blood Meridian follows this character known as the Boy as he tags along with the Glanton Gang, or scalp hunters. They're paid by the Mexican government to kill Apaches, getting paid per scalp. And once they realize that one scalp basically looks like another, they turn their violence on anyone they come across, carving a bloody swath across Mexico. And the standout character from that novel is undoubtedly Judge Holden. A judge of what, you might ask? That's a question the characters in the book ask too. They do not get an answer, and neither do we. And even among these craven members of the Glanton Gang, the judge, he stands out. He is everything they are, magnified, large, hairless, pale. The judge speaks several languages, dances, loves to catalog unique items before destroying them. He philosophizes. He acts according to that philosophy, making his violence seem less base, I guess, and like driven by some personal whim, and feels more like an inevitable results, right? The Glanton gang kill and rape for pleasure and profit. The judge does it because he feels it's right to do so. In the book, when one of the other members of the gang asks him his trade, the judge replies, "It is war," and he gives this explanation. "Men are born for games, nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows, too, that the worth or merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put at hazard. Suppose 2 men at cards with nothing to wager save their lives. Who has not heard of such a tale? A turn of the card. The whole universe for such a player has labored, clanking to this moment, which will tell if he is to die at that man's hand or that man at his. What more certain validation of a man's worth could there be? This enhancement of the game to its ultimate state admits no argument concerning the notion of fate. The selection of one man over another is a preference absolute and irrevocable, and it is a dull man indeed who could reckon so profound a decision without agency or significance either one. In such games as have for their stake the annihilation of the defeated, the decisions are quite clear. This man holding this particular arrangement of cards in his hands is thereby removed from existence. This is the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will, which because it binds them is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. Blood Meridian feels primordial. You'll see people talking about the novel as a deconstruction of the violence in a Western, one that turns up the violence so much that you're startled from apathy about the classic gunfight. It's not a showdown between the white hat and the black hat. It's a criticism that forces you to see these Western archetypes in no other terms than flagrant, horrific murder. And I do think that's true, but I also think it undersells the novel. I've been thinking about it for years. So when I picked up John Williams' Butcher's Crossing and read it, I couldn't help but mentally compare the two throughout. And that is what this episode is about. Why I was wrong to do that. Poking around a bit more about Butcher's Crossing online, reading some things before I did this episode, I would often see these two paired together as revisionist Westerns. And I guess that is true enough, and I can't stop you from comparing the two, but I think the comparisons, at least the ones I've seen, they don't seem like a meaningful comparison to me, right? All the time we compare things in everything, books, movies, historical events, etc., etc. And I'm often struck that these comparisons are not always, but they often seem to be stuck in kind of a ground floor understanding of a work or a real life event. And to me, it almost seems like a disservice. I mean, I think I've made this comment on the podcast before, but it's like when you see an American publication comparing Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude to like literally any other foreign book with even moderate amounts of magical realism. And it's really banal. Thing A has similar elements to Thing B. Okay, so what? And that's what I mean when I say a meaningful comparison. It's a comparison that looks at more than just similarities, but actually explores the themes of a work, or maybe has a properly contextualized understanding of that real-world event, or both real-world events you're comparing. It's a comparison that, in my mind, is enlightening, that helps you understand what we're talking about better. It has an answer to so what. So to talk about why, so what for Butcher's Crossing and so what for Blood Meridian are pretty different so whats. Why read these two novels, in my mind, which are set in the same genre and similar environments, similar-ish. The more I say it, the more they diverge in my mind. Similar genre. Let's leave it there. Let's talk first about Butcher's Crossing. Now, this summary I'm going to give is going to talk about the broad plot of the book. I'm not going to get into every specific, so if you want to read it, you'll still have things that will be a surprise to you. It is the 1870s. The buffalo hide trade is flourishing, and our protagonist is Will Andrews, a young man from Massachusetts, the son of a Unitarian minister, a student at Harvard. We get the sense that he's had a fairly plush upbringing. He's a big fan of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he really kind of wants to find himself, especially, or it must be through nature, per Emerson. And that's become an obsession of his. And it's such an obsession that when the novel opens, he's already dropped out of college and is arriving in Butcher's Crossing, a frontier town in Kansas. He's searching for how to become himself, or how to really become a man out in true nature, the real world, not this false world of buildings and work and all that. And when he arrives, he meets a man who his father had known years ago, named J.D. McDonald. Now, McDonald is a trader of buffalo hides. He's a financier of hunting expeditions. And McDonald tries to convince Andrews to work for him, to do the paperwork. But for Andrews, that's not the point of coming out here. And reluctantly, knowing that Andrews wants adventure, McDonald tells him to find a hunter, Miller. And once Andrews does find Miller, the man pitches him an expedition. It used to be that buffalo carpeted the land around Butcher's Crossing, but they've been hunted thin. You have to ride further and further out to find them. The ones who are left tend to be younger, tend to have thinner hides. They're further out. They're less profitable. But Miller, years ago, had traveled to the mountains, an area where no one else he knew had been, and had seen a massive herd there, which is untouched by this ever-expanding industry. And if he can find them again, they can hunt high-quality pelts to their heart's content. Thousands of them. It would be a windfall. And more importantly for Andrews, more than a windfall, which is he doesn't care about the money as much as he cares about becoming a man in some way, joining these men as they go and do something real. So he agrees to fund the expedition, as long as he can tag along. And Miller gets together a group, him, Andrews, and two other men, Charlie Hodge and Fred Schneider. Hodge, who will drive the wagon and tend to the camp, is a longtime companion of Miller's. He's highly religious, always carrying a Bible and proselytizing when he gets the chance, but he's also an inveterate alcoholic. Fred Schneider, their skinner, clearly doesn't believe in the expedition from the start. He doubts that buffalo will still be there, and instead of taking a percentage of the sales, he chooses to take his payment per month, $60, whatever they find. And as far as he's concerned, this whole facade is going to last maybe a month, probably a little more, and then they'll return empty-handed, except for him, who will have somewhere north of $60. Before they leave, Andrews also spends time with a woman in Butcher's Crossing, Francine. She works there as a prostitute, and the pair get along pretty well. She even invites Andrews to spend the week before his departure in her room, and as she tells him, she wants to lay with him while he's still soft, before he comes back with rough hands, like every other frontiersman who hires her out there. Andrews, for his part, panics, and then literally sprints out of the room after she undresses. This moment hangs on his mind when they take the trail, and he has a long time to think about it, because the group does make it out to the mountain meadow, and they do find the buffalo, and they kill and skin them by the thousands, eating some meat, letting most of it rot. It's way more than they can take back in a single trip. They know they'll have to return several times to get it all. And Schneider keeps urging the group to leave, because they already have more they can carry. But as they continue killing the herd, Miller becomes more like an automaton, refusing to leave until every single buffalo is dead, a goal he does not explain but refuses to let go of. And he's the only one who knows the route back, so they don't have any choice but to keep going. And this bloodlust ends up screwing them, because the first winter storm arrives early. And with no way out of the mountains, they hunker down and wait, and wait, and wait. Months go by. It's never clear exactly how many. Miller in the book guesses between 6 and 8, and you've got the month beforehand and several weeks of travel time as well. So it is the better part of a year before they get back to Butcher's Crossing. Except now the town is ramshackle. Half the businesses are gone, and more than half of the people are missing. They go to find McDonald, who'd guaranteed to buy their hides, but he is also gone. When they finally track him down in the common house, he tells them He can't buy their hides anymore, not even if he wanted to. He's out of money, out of business. The demand for buffalo hide has fallen through the floor. People just don't want them anymore. All their hides from these thousands of buffalo are now worthless. Just like the beaver trade before it, he reminds Miller. And that leaves Andrews in a daze, and he returns to Francine, now with the presence of mind to take up with her, at least for a time. After he goes to her room, she feels his newly roughened hands, and he says, "I'm sorry. It's not the same as it was, is it?" "No," said Francine, "but it's all right. I'm glad you came back." And that's where we leave Andrews, certain of not except one thing, that he will not return home. Yusio. So, as I mentioned earlier, as with Blood Meridian, when you look this book up, the first thing you are going to find are people talking about, maybe not necessarily people, reviews, short summaries of the novel, which will describe it as sort of a critique of the classic Western, as maybe a deconstruction of it. It's on the back of the book. That's how the back of the book describes it. That's how you'll see it in other places. And like Blood Meridian, that is true. And yet, after reading it, I have to say that that was not really what compelled me about the story. Now, it was the, I will say, overriding theme throughout. I think that's what everything else in this book feeds into. But to just focus on that and not examine the ways in which it actually provides that criticism of the genre, I think kind of does it a disservice. So let me, before we talk about some of those things, I wanted to pull a line from this article, Butcher's Crossing, The Husks and Shells of Exploitation by Jack Brenner, who writes this about the genre as a whole. Quote, "Western fiction celebrates the bloody nose, our encounter with what we have fondly taken to be fact. Filled blizzards, mountains, dry marshes, empty distance. It is a fiction of endurance and pain, played out in that vast landscape where death waits only a misstep or argument away. Remarkably, though, in a fiction so dedicated to pain, there is little sense of evil. A tone of ultimate beneficence blankets the heroic endurance. Evil seems unreal, contained, turned finally to the service of triumph." And a little later, Brenner takes a quote from the writer Wallace Stegner. "In Western fiction, there is little of the iron sense of enduring pain and evil that in Hawthorne, Melville, Faulkner, and even Twain counterbalances the complacent innocence of the New World. Are Westerners so stupid that they don't believe in evil? Or so smug that they have no personal hells to descend into?" That I just love that line. But I think it does set this up nicely. Overridingly, yes, this is a novel which is confronting the Western. However, there are a couple things I wanted to examine within that. First of all, there is the relationship to the land. There is the people in the land, Miller, Andrews, Schneider, Hodge, Francine. There is also there's Andrew's relationship to Francine specifically, and then there is how the novel ends, how they're crushed underfoot by the world around them. Not by a struggle against something they can see, a vast army they can fight. They're not playing, so to speak, cowboys and Indians like I don't think they've sold those toys for a long time, but, I'd see ads for them when I watched old VHS tapes when I was a kid, right? That kind of style where evil can be evil, so to speak, in the style of the Western, evil just being whoever basically opposes our cowboy hero can be shot down at the gun. You can't shoot down lack of demand for buffalo hide, right? We'll come back to that. Let's start with nature itself, because this is pretty central. The thing that starts this journey is Andrews reading a lot of Ralph Waldo Emerson and wanting to find himself in nature, find the man he is meant to be, in some way that this is a more real manhood. Before we actually talk about it, I do have to say that I have not read Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I probably never will. That is, of all the philosophy that I've been interested in my life, that's simply not one of them. If you want to know more about this book's relationship to Emerson and the Transcendentalist movement as a whole, that article I mentioned just a minute ago by Jack Brenner, which you can find a link to in the show notes, that's a great one. There are also plenty of others. Another article I found really enlightening was Pragmatist Individuals in the 19th Century American West in Wallace Stegner's Angles of Repose and John Billiams' Butcher's Crossing. There are also lots more. There's lots to say about that. I'm not informative enough to really give you a half-remembered summary, so let's talk about the land itself, because throughout the book, Andrews has an evolving relationship with the land, and one that's quite uneven. Maybe you could go through and trace an arc, but overwhelmingly, I am tempted to say the relationship to the land is less one that is specifically a growing evolution from one point to another, but an evolving conception which grows larger and larger, one which ends with the land less symbolic of anything in particular and more the land itself, right? When Andrews first arrives at the mountain pass, which happens after weeks of travel, through which Andrews, who has, again, lived a pretty comfortable life up to this point, is, metaphorically speaking, half dead. He has not really ridden horses before. He has not traveled long stretches with little water and little food. His butt's numb. His muscles ache. He is growing, darkened under the sun. He's probably burned to hell and back. And when he gets there, he has this sense of the forest as a frightening thing. And then he kind of gets over that. Let me take this from page 111. Quote, "For a moment, as he and Schneider and Miller pressed their horses directly into the face of the forest, Andrews had a sensation of sinking, as if he were being absorbed downward into a softness without boundary or mark. The sound of their horses' breathing, the clop of their hooves, and even the few words the men spoke, all were absorbed in the quiet of the forest, so that all sound came muted and distant and calm, one sound much the same as another. Whether it was the snort of a horse or a spoken word, all was reduced to soft thuds, which seemed to come not from themselves, but from the forest, as if there beat within it a giant heart for anyone to hear." And Andrews then goes on to wonder at how he could have found fear looking at this, and instead that is replaced by a sense of comfort and security, as if meeting an old friend. So early in the novel, we have this conception through Andrews of something that's welcoming him. It is giving him his chance to find out who he is, and he's excited to do it. When they find the buffalo and begin the hunt, he is ready to shoot the buffalo. He is ready to skin the buffalo, and he takes to those fairly quickly. It is not in those moments that he finds the horror. He doesn't see the killing of this creature and all of a sudden think, oh my God, this is horrible. He is instead frustrated that he's not a very good skinner. That's his immediate reaction. And he keeps at it until he, by the end, turns into a pretty decent skinner, not quite keeping up with Schneider, but he can do 2 buffalo for every one that Schneider does. And this is why I say it kind of rejects a simple line. There are moments where he has kinds of flashes, but it's not like an even point A to point B kind of evolution. While they're hunting buffalo, Andrews is struck by the sort of, God, I'm trying to think of the word. It's not, I don't think diminution is the right word, or even a real word, actually. The how nature becomes diminished in the face of what they're doing. And it's not the land itself. The land itself is not really affected, but he does see it in the buffalo, for example. So when he, at one point in the novel, this is fairly early on, page 130, he approaches them, he has this thought, quote, "Andrew regarded the felled buffalo with some mixture of feeling. On the ground, unmoving, it no longer had that kind of wild dignity and power that he had imputed to it only a few minutes before, and though the body made a dark mound on the earth, its size seemed somehow diminished. The shaggy black head was cocked a little to one side, held so by one horn that had fallen upon an unevenness in the ground. The other horn was broken at the tip. The small eyes, half closed but still brightly shining in the sun, stared gently ahead. The hooves were surprisingly small, almost delicate, cloven neatly like those of a calf. The thin ankles seemed incapable of having supported the weight of the great animal. The broad swelling side was covered with scars. Some were so old that the fur had nearly covered them, but others were new and shone flat and dark blue on the flesh. From one nostril, a drop of blood thickened in the sun and dropped upon the grass." And so here we see Andrews approaching, and so here we see kind of a different perspective, right? When Emerson is writing about nature, not so much about the animals, that's not so much what's in Andrews' thoughts going into this, but he approaches these as things things that should be rightly conquered. But when he does, he notices that this great power that he sees in the buffalo specifically, not in nature around it, but this piece of nature it's diminished by what they do to it. And it's diminished literally because they kill so many. This individual one loses all semblance of what it is, what it could be. Most of it is wasted, and it seems like a calf to him. Those are the words. The hooves are small. It seems almost childish now. It is in some way lessened by this death. And I think, at least the way I'm reading it, Andrews begins to see the relationship between the land and the things within it. Not quite here. Here he sees, it's a very early stage. He sees a great power of something in nature, and then it seems lessened by the death, by this shooting. And it's not until later on, late in the hunting season, there is a point when they have killed already thousands of buffalo, and they have moved further into the valley. And at this point, it takes them some amount of time to ride out to even find the herd, which is even more of a problem because they don't take each one of these buffalo back to skin it. They skin it where it lies, and they take the pelt back. So the further out the buffalo are, the longer their job is. They have to work late into the night. And at one point, the buffalo even try to leave the valley. And Miller freaks out at this. And he has all of them line up around this mouth and begins shooting at them as they come closer. And as he shoots at them, they turn away and run back into the valley, which Miller rejoices at. Of course, that's what they want. But there's this moment where Andrews suddenly sees them not as something to be killed for a pelt, but as something that has some semblance of reason. Just a couple of them have blocked this off and begun firing shots that could not kill them, but they can be hurt. They're using smaller rifles here. These are varmint hunting rifles, not necessarily what they meant for hunting. Not necessarily meant for hunting, but this pain drives a couple back, and the others see those wounded ones fleeing and follow them. And this is what happens on page 168. Quote, "A tremor of elation that he could not understand went through Andrews. I never thought anything like that was possible," he said to Miller. It was almost as if they were doing it together, as if they'd planned it. It seemed to him that he had not really thought of the buffalo before. He had skinned them by the hundreds, he had killed a few, he had eaten of their flesh, he had smelled their stench, he had been immersed in their blood, but he had not thought of them before as he was thinking of them now. Do they do things like that often? So despite Andrews' obsession with nature, growing him as a man, it's really just the idea of empty land. And over the course of his time in the valley, he's beginning to, I think, associate kind of the fullness of nature a little more. And of course, we as the readers see the irony much more starkly than Andrews does. This is not a full revelation. There is at no point in this novel that Andrews suddenly looks around and says, "My God, what are we doing?" But we as readers can see that. Very early on in the novel, they pass a Native American village, a very small one, and Miller's remarks that what's left is, to him, pathetic. And he remarks, they're not even worth shooting anymore. And that, to the reader, that's something that Andrews does not remark on, does not even apparently to think about. But we as the readers can see this obsession with this idea of going out to where no one was before, where a private space, is not true. It has been depopulated. This land that Andrews is seeking out was the home of peoples before, and they have been wiped out. It is the land of buffalo, which once carpeted the fields, and they have been wiped out. And now Andrews is part of that process. And he has a little spark here, much later on, where he, despite becoming a part of them, in many ways he feels like, I think he has become sort of a man now. Now he knows how to skin, now he knows how to hunt. But he's not really thought about the relationship these things have to the wider world. He has an incomplete notion. And I think he starts to get a semblance of that now. And he knows that in some way, what he's doing is a negative action. Just a few pages before, he thinks, quote, he's at night thinking of Francine and why he had turned away. And he begins to think about his turning away from Francine in the same context as his first time seeing a buffalo and thinking that it has been diminished by its death. Quote, "It came to him that he had turned away from the buffalo, not because of the shock at seeing the buffalo, a few moments before proud and noble and full of the dignity of life, now stark and helpless, a length of inert meat divested of self, and his notion of itself swinging grotesquely, mocking, before him. Actually, as I'm reading this, I'm realizing that that's actually when he brings a buffalo back to camp to slaughter it for meat, not the earlier scene, but neither here nor there. Swinging grotesquely, mocking before him. It was not itself, or it was not the self that he had imagined it to be. That self was murdered, and in that murder he had felt the destruction of something within him, and he had not been able to face it, so he had turned away. Andrews has come out here seeking pristine, empty land to become himself, and instead he has found land that has been killed. He finds a land that is missing its populations, and he has come to be a part of that process, to continue to kill that population. And he gets a small notion of it throughout this novel, not one fully embraced, but one that continues to haunt him as he recognizes that he, in participating in this, has not become himself. He has lost something within him, a sort of innocence, if you want to call it that, of living in the world where they exist as beneficiaries of the system. To a lesser degree. It's not that the trade is based on it, but certainly people back where he's coming from are the ones who want to be wearing items made from buffalo pelts. Of course, small part of the economy, not something he would deal with every day, but still part of the world he came from. And I think we as readers can start to see this bringing together of the land and the creatures within it. But also, the land exists on its own. It doesn't care about Andrews. It doesn't reveal anything to him. He has this sense of it early on that it's a place of life, but it simply is. When they're snowed in, at some point in the long months of waiting, Andrews steps out of his tent to go walk around to capture this feeling again, and instead, because everything is covered in snow and he forgets his snow glasses, made out of jury-rigged ones made out of buffalo hide leather, he ends up snowblind. He can't actually see it. It instead of revealing itself to him, it simply does what it does. It reflects light off snow into his eyes and burns his retinas a little bit. It doesn't have anything to reveal to him necessarily. It just is. And when I say this isn't a simple point A to point B, it's not like how I'm talking about him is where he ends. When he leaves the valley, he has a strange sense of nostalgia for it, even while he's still there. Like, there has been something special in this time before he goes back and he loses it forever, even though he knows he will be back in this area. And maybe what that thing is the sort of innocence he had before he became a full participant in the destruction of nature, which is not just the land, the trees, but the people, the populations, the things within it. Those things which are now missing. And as long as we're talking about how it affects them, I guess we should probably point out also the irony here, wherein Andrews is among people who are already living the dream from his perspective. Miller is an almost mythical mountain man. No matter what the situation is, he knows what to do. He is willing to push a little further. He will take the less safe route because he knows it will get them where they go. He chooses to take the risks to get what they want. He takes a more direct route into the mountains to save them time because he knows that's the way that will wind them up there, even though they go long days, up to a week or more without water. But he trusts in it. When the snow comes, he knows instantly what to do. He knows how to help them survive through this whole time. Throughout the winter months, Charlie Hodge, he's reduced to drinking most of the day. Thin alcohol to preserve what's left. Andrews wanders around. Schneider, who's already disgusted with this whole venture and pissed that they did not leave when he said they should, as he rightly so, contributes a little. Miller is the one who goes out to hunt to keep them alive. He brings back game. In fact, he even brings back a bear at one point. Miller is living the dream, the Emersonian dream from Andrew's perspective, but Miller doesn't care. He's not affected by the environment. He has a job to do. In fact, he is just there to destroy the environment. Schneider cares even less. He's there to get his $60, and then he wants to go home. At some point, he remarks that he really wants to go back to St. Louis, and Miller chides him and says, I didn't really take you for a high-living man. And Schneider says, well, after being out here, I realized I think I am. Hodge is almost a non-entity, and we'll talk more about him later. But they are not these frontiersmen who are living what Andrews wants, who are the embodiment of what he wants to be, have no appreciation for it, and they are not made better by being out in the nature. Schneider goes out and says, I want to go the hell back home. You know what I want to do? I want to get my $60. I want to go and buy some booze. I want to buy a nice bed, and then I'm going to hire Francine. That's his literal goal. He wants to go back and hire Francine. So he talks about that throughout the book, initially to rib Andrews, but later on just because he is so sick of being out here. And Miller, not only is he not interested in learning, he becomes lessened by coming out here, not inherently, but because he has come out here to destroy. Over the course of their time in the wilderness, he becomes less and less human to Andrews. Even in the early days when he begins hunting the buffalo, Andrews notes that he sort of loses his ability to express himself, do anything other than kill. He has nothing on his mind except finding finding better ways to herd the buffalo so he can kill all of them. When he begins shooting at them, Andrews notices this, quote, for a moment Miller did not answer. His arms hung long at his sides, his shoulders drooped, and there was on his face an expression of emptiness. His mouth hung slightly opened, and his head swung from side to side as he gazed upon the receding field of dead buffalo. He swung his body around to Schneider. That mechanicalness, it continues, it grows in him. Throughout the winter months, Andrews grows to have this view of him. Quote, he came to have an image of Miller that persisted even when Miller was not in his sight. He saw Miller's face, black and dull with powder smoke, his white teeth clenched behind his stretched-out leathery lips, and his eyes, black and shining in their whites, surrounded by a flaming line of irritated lids. Sometimes this image of Miller came into his mind at night in his dreams, and more than once he came awake with a start and thrust himself upward out of his bedroll, and found that he was breathing quickly, shallowly, as if in fright, as if the sharp image of those eyes upon him dulled and faded and died in the darkness around him. Once he dreamed he was some kind of animal who was being pursued. He felt a relentless presence that chased him from cover to cover, or at least penned him in a corner of blackness from which there was no retreat. Before he awoke in fear, or at a dreamed explosion of violence, he thought he caught a glimpse of those eyes burning at him from the darkness. Miller becomes this monstrous figure, a destroying monster, destroying angel, less than human by this. Just a few pages later, quote, and as the buffalo pressed dumbly, instinctively out of the valley, the slaughter grew more and more intense. Already withdrawn and spare with words, Miller became with the passing days almost totally intent upon his kill. And even at night in the camps, he no longer gave voice to his simplest needs. He gestured towards the coffee pot. He grunted when his name was spoken, and his directions to the rest of them became curt motions of hands and arms, jerks of the head, and guttural growlings deep in his throat. These men out here on the frontier, contrary to Turner's frontier thesis, which, if you haven't read, in short, proposes this idea of America as a unique nation because of this frontier, because the city is stagnant. And Turner thinks of nations as a sort of living organism, an organism which must adapt to its environment or die. In nations which have only this civilization, these cities contain, and that is end to end, one side of the nation to the other already settled, there's nowhere for anything to go, whereas the frontier provides a place for these people to go out and challenge themselves against harsher realities, people who are in some ways more vibrant, to go out and prove that, to conquer something. And that encourages a sort of sense of growth, expansion, of great individuality, which then meshes with the possibility of civilization. Turner doesn't completely turn his nose up at it. Of course, there are many more things available in a city than there are out in the frontier, and this combination of these two things, the power of the city and the vivacity of the people who can go out and live in the frontier and bring those experiences back, that is what creates a unique nation. Miller is not gaining some sort of vivacity out here. He is becoming thoroughly lesser. He's diminished. He's less than human. Among these creatures, Andrews never really feels a sense of fear at them, only wonder. But he begins to think of Miller as an animal. At some point later on, when Miller kills the bear, he comes back with it across his shoulders, and Andrews gets the sense for a moment that this is something here to hunt him, that this is an animal creature coming to get them, and that is the only time he feels fear. The animal, not a bad thing to have in animals, nothing to fear. In Miller, it becomes grotesque, it becomes horrifying. So when we say this is a deconstruction of those tropes, it's not just that, it is sort of a more complex embrace of the environment in which they are in. One which has nothing in particular to say about it, I would say. Nothing to say, exactly. It doesn't have a final determination on what this means. It opens up a wider array of possibilities and gives you reminders of what this land was. And it points out that many of the people out here are not out here for noble reasons. They're out here to make a little money. Miller is out here out of bloodlust. Schneider's out here to get enough cash to go back and live a little bit of high life. Hodge, he's just here. He goes along with Miller. That's all he does. He's not made a better man. He reads the Bible. He proselytizes. That's where it begins and ends. And Andrews, in a little twist of irony as being a preacher's son, realizes that he is not even able to keep up with Hodge. And this is something that turns ugly later on. I didn't mention this in the summary, so I guess skip ahead about a minute, maybe a minute 50 to be safe for this next part. But on the way back, after they survived this winter, as they're crossing a river, Schneider's killed in a freak accident. Most of them have crossed. Only Schneider is left in the river watching as Hodges brings the wagon across, and a log broken off at some point in the winter comes rushing down, and the speed of the river, the highness of it, makes it loud. And when Andrews calls out a warning, Schneider can't hear him, and he spends the last moments of his life coming a little closer and putting his hand up to his ear, essentially say, what are you saying? And he's hit by the log. His horse tips over, he goes into the water, and he comes up, but the horse panicking kicks him in the face, and he goes under, dead immediately. That log also overturns their wagon, knocks away all of their pelts. Now, they have more. There are thousands more in the valley. They couldn't carry them all back. But that's not really the point here. Afterwards, all of their work for naught, not undone by evil forces necessarily, but undone by a freak accident of nature. Andrews feels obviously quite bad about Schneider's death. Not bad in that he caused it, although he feels some guilt that he had been trying to get his attention. But Hodges dismisses him. Hodges says, essentially, he was a philanderer. He laid with scarlet women. He was a sinner. There's no reason to be sad for him. There's no reason to mourn. He is so wrapped up in his religion that he can't see the humanity in other people. That is his own way of being disconnected from all this. Miller is made less than human. Hodges is uninterested in engaging with other people who aren't up to his exacting standards. And irony, which exists alongside his own drunkenness. Something the Bible also does not take a particularly kind view on, but of course that has never stopped anyone who is a real Bible thumper, those are two different things, from condemning others. And his has thoroughly separated him from humanity in its own way. If you aren't living up to his exacting standards, why feel bad when you die? These are not people who are elevated by this experience. Finally, I want to talk about Francine. This character who's not in the novel for very long and doesn't have a great deal of lines where she's outside of her role. She spends a lot of her time almost as a maid, a sort of free waitress who sits around the bar, gets drinks from Miller when he asks, and then on occasion talks to Andrews, but expresses a genuine interest in him. She wants to sleep with him, wants him to spend time with her because he's unlike all the others. He's young, he's soft, he has not yet been turned leathery by this work, and in that same youthfulness, Andrews is afraid of it, of what she's offering him, of her. and this is a little bit of editorialization on my part, but I wonder if on some level this depiction is also, it kind of connects with this search for this great idea, leaves not much room for a lot of normal human experiences. He has got to go out and become a man, find himself in nature. And when Francine says, "Come here, lay with me," he runs from a fairly earnest sexual relationship, not as he looks back on it out of fear of that moment. He doesn't know what drives him to go out of that room. He wants it going into that. And I can't help but think of, I think this is an example I've given before, but, and of course, a sexual relationship, a fairly normal part of life, mundane, too mundane to be elevated for many philosophies. And I'm not talking to you from a lens of philosophy so much, or of reading here, but just in life of noticing there is a perpetual crisis of people, let's say. I mean, right now, I think that's died up, but for a while, there's like a year or two where you would read everywhere about men in crisis. And I think the truth is that men have always been in crisis, and women have also always been in crisis, and everyone else who does not fall into those categories have been in crisis, because all the time, everywhere, there's been expectations for people, and expectations are always higher than the reality. And then or now specifically, let's angle in on this sort of so-called crisis of men, masculinity, whatever, which is had too much ink spilled about it, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about it because I don't really want to talk about it. I'm not that interested in that. All the same, I think, despite the fact that the form of masculinity that is being pursued here in Butcher's Crossing, the forms of masculinity which were actually being pushed in the 1960s when this book was written, and those forms of masculinity which are sought after today are all altogether different things. The rejection of that mundanity in favor of finding something. That's something we're going to talk about later when McDonald, after Andrews returns, accuses young people of always thinking that there's something out there. I think specifically in this context, I have seen more than one young man. I'm not going to give specifics of any of these cases, but I don't think any of those people will ever listen to this podcast. But just in case, I have known more than one young man who has blown up a relationship or blown up his life to some degree in some search for masculinity. I have to go elsewhere and find it. I have to break away from what I know. This regularity of my life in some way is making me lesser because I'm not out searching for something, because I'm not finding a greatness. And I'm not going to tell you that there's never a reason to step away from where you are. There are plenty of reasons to. There's many, many good reasons to step away from the life you're in, cut people off. There's plenty of good reasons to do that. But in these particular cases, I have just known young men for no really strong reason who have rejected everyday things. And I think about one particular case, which would happen to a friend of mine whose, boyfriend broke up with her because he needed to go find his manhood before he could settle down with anyone. He had to really figure out that he had to figure out whatever that thing was, and he couldn't name what it was, so he had to identify what it was, and then he had to go and get it. And he couldn't do that while he was in a relationship, while he was tied down. And the thing that she said to me, which has always struck with me, which is, I already thought, once upon a time, I thought he was a good man, the kind of person he wanted to be. I thought he was that. And now I think back, and if you were to ask me what is a good man today, I'd say a good man is someone who I can rely on, who I can trust, who I can believe in, who I think is going to be there when the going gets tough. And it's not that often when you hear this is, again, a very modern context, these sort of young men who want to be that rugged, reliable, maybe not reliable isn't the word, that sort of rugged person who can do it all and do everything, but very rarely they'll talk about what they talk up the idea of family, and they'll say, well, I'll fight for it. They want to engage in violence. They want to engage in all these cool things, this childish view, but they don't want to do the everyday living. They don't want to support a family. They don't want to think about, sometimes, look, not every job in the world is going to be the best job in the world. Sometimes it's something you do to get by or support a family. And also supporting your family, doing the dishes, cleaning your house, supporting your partner through daily things, taking your share of the emotional toil of everyday life, remembering birthdays, remembering to reach out to people, those mundane everythings which are so important for relationships, which are not elevated, not masculine, and thereby made lesser. Even though this whole ideology purports to be in search of becoming this, often a leader for the family. That's not every case of masculinity here. This is a very specific type of, usually somewhat religious conservatism, I guess, that I've run into in my life. But all this desire to find something elevated, to fight for a family, it's never interested in the mundanities. And I think I'm getting way off topic, but to me, again, I'm editorializing, but that's a little of what I see here, is this search for this elevated thing in so many people, past and present, causes them to push away otherwise good things. And again, don't get that confused with the notion that you should never leave, or that you shouldn't go seek those bigger things if that really is, you think, is in the cards for you. But take that consideration seriously. And if it's right for you, it's right for you. I'm just saying I've seen people who it wasn't right for, and it ended up blowing up in their faces. Or they came back, crawling back, and got back in the relationship. So let's get back on topic. I think on some level, Andrews begins to realize that. Not to the degree I'm talking about here, but begins to look back at that moment, at that rejection, and evolves his thinking on it. Let's actually, let me just read you the quote. Quote, he thinks this, quote, he thought of Francine. He could not bring her image to his mind, and he did not try. He thought her as flesh, as softness, as warmth. Though he did not know why, and though it did not occur to him to wonder why, he thought of her as a part of himself that could not quite make another part of himself warm. Somehow he had pushed that part away from him once. He felt himself sinking towards that warm. And cold, before he met it, he slept again. Again, editorialization on my part. Francine, I think, is sort of this representative of a fairly normal part of life, and even a little bit more of an innocent part of life, engaging in fairly normal, mundane human activities, as opposed to coming out here into the wilderness to kill in great measures for profit. And now that part, which that is something that was within him. Of course, he came from that sort of life, a very comfortable one, and he pushes it away. And although he seeks it out, he's living in the reality that he is no longer there. And when he returns to Francine at the end of the book, that line that I quoted earlier, she feels his rough hands and says, he says it's not the same as it was. And she says, no, but I'm glad you came back. And that's one of the things I love about this book. When he returns, he is changed, and really not for the better. And the people around him know it. Things are not the same. They cannot be. He has done too much. You cannot go out in the world and do these things and suddenly absolve yourself of your sins by feeling bad about it. Things are different now. But that's not the end. It's not a pessimistic novel on that front. They still make up what they can now that he embraces that. Andrews still, though, we don't know where we leave him, because at the end of their time together, he leaves most of the rest of the money he has on her desk, and he walks out early in the morning before she wakes up. And he knows that he will not go back to where he came from. He will not go back east, and he doesn't know where he's going to go, but he just gets on his horse and he starts walking. He's still in some way searching. So this is not a completely pessimistic novel. This is not a point A to point B, and this is why I think it is more interesting than just saying that it's a takedown, because it's a novel that very much lives in the genre. In some ways, although it questions a lot of these tropes we've been talking about, it questions this idea of the Emersonian self that you can find in nature, of the great adventure and glory you can find by going out, how cool and how much you can build yourself as a man by living these experiences. That rings hollow, and yet he's not just going to give up. He keeps walking on forward. It's interested in these ideas, but it's also interested in engaging very honestly, very earnestly, I should say, maybe more than honestly, about kind of feeling those tendencies all the same, which I think makes it very interesting. It doesn't end on a condemning note. It ends on a note of possibility, maybe a sort of hopefulness, maybe more hopefulness than is warranted, but a hopefulness all the same. And yet now he does it in a world that has changed. It's moved on. Even while they are walking out to the mountains, they find train tracks on the way. That is the sign of the death of this Wild West era. Civilization, so to speak. Of course, there were many civilizations that existed there before. Civilization, in the typical sense that we use it, is coming to this area. Things are changing. And the great irony is that not all things that are built up are meant to last. At the beginning of the book, McDonald's tells Andrews that he needs to work for him because the train's coming here. When it comes, buyers are going to come. And at the end of the novel, as he's talking to McDonald, they find out, yeah, the train's coming, but it's stopping at a town 50 miles north of here. Not all these expeditions out here are going to lead to something. More of them fail than not. A couple of them make it fabulously wealthy, and those are the success stories that make it the history books that are then celebrated in years to come. He spends a lot of his time with Francine thinking of horror in some sense. This horror on Schneider's face in the split second he saw it before the horse kicks it, at this sort of senseless fury that he sees on it. Why did he die? For no reason. Because of a freak accident. When they make it back, McDonald is not able to buy Miller's pelts. There's no money to buy them with. There is no one who will buy their pelts. It has moved on. The demand is gone. And Miller loses his mind. He goes down to he goes down to McDonald's drying fields where he has some number of hundreds, thousands of pelt, and he burns them all. And McDonald initially defends that before he grows tired and wanders off, and Andrews says, you said it yourself, those are worthless. Why were you trying to defend them? And he says, I don't know, I guess just the idea that they were mine. And then Miller rides off to an unknown fate. Charlie Hodge, who after returning doesn't even recognize Andrews. He appears to think that it is before they've even left for the journey. He has lost his mind. He wanders off on foot after Miller. These characters are not destined for greatness. They're destined probably to die in the wilderness. McDonald's is destined to go back east, try again, start something new. And he admonishes Andrews for this little journey. You wanted to go out and find something. Well, quote, young people, McDonald said contemptuously, you always think there's something to find out. Yes, sir, Andrews said. Well, there's nothing, McDonald said. You get born, and you nurse on lies, and you get weaned on lies, and you learn fancier lies in school, you live all your life on lies, and then maybe when you're ready to die, it comes to you that there's nothing but yourself and what you could have done. Only you ain't done it, because the lies you told there was something else. Then you could have had the word. Only you ain't done it because the lies told you there was something else. Then you know you could have had the world because you're the only one who knows the secret. Only then it's too late. You're too old. You ain't learned yet. Look, you spend nearly a year of your life in sweat because you have faith in the dream of a fool. And what have you got? Nothing. You kill 3,000-4,000 buffalo and stack their skins neat, and the buffalo will rot where you left them, and the rats will nest in their skins. And what have you got to show? A year gone out of your life, a busted wagon that a beaver might use to make a dam with, some calluses on your hands, and the memory of a dead man. Of all the things in the novel, I think that is the greatest condemnation of the novel, of this idea of America that is wrapped up in the Western, that there is something out there to find. Of course, Andrews doesn't accept that, and I don't necessarily think the novel means this completely unironically. Obviously, Andrews does not sit with that in the end. He goes off still, seemingly in search of something, or at least ready to let whatever comes come. It implies there is something for him to be found. But I think all the same, this is something to take seriously, if not swallow it whole exactly. But this is this attitude of there is something to find. For some people, they go out there with this attitude, there's something to find, and they build something great. For most people who try that, it's a failure. And underneath those attempts are the bones of so many who get crushed underfoot in the process. Because, as the words McDonald they have faith in the dreams of a fool. I think it's, again, the novel still lets Andrews search. It doesn't end on this note that that's the case. But it is a very kind of in the sense of Dostoevsky, where Dostoevsky will argue a point and then bring in a character who brings in a pretty good counter argument, and then your point of view character says, I really don't have a counter argument to that, to your counter argument. I don't have anything to say to your counter argument. That might even be valid, but I still have a faith, a belief. I can't let go of this. It's a good dialogue to have, a good reminder, a good criticism to keep in the back of your mind, even if you don't choose to believe it. If anything, for me, this is the tagline of the novel. You always think there's something to find out. In this moment, Andrew sees in MacDonald horror It is the same horror we've been talking about before, the horror on Schneider's face, the horror in seeing Miller, the horror in seeing Hodge's emptiness. These characters are reduced by this misadventure, by this whole life. And the irony is that they are not doing it for themselves. They are doing it for a larger system of capital, one that doesn't care about them, one that is based on the demands of people far away who want Buffalo to look nicer. And when they're done thinking Buffalo looks nice, they move on something else. And in its wake, it leaves highly reduced buffalo populations, beaver populations before that, people, animal, gone, all to satisfy a consumer good, a demand for a consumer good, one that will move on to something new when the season changes. And it's a condemnation of all those people too, because it's not just Miller, it's not just Schneider, it's not just Hodge. These people are lessened by these experiences, but they go out there because there is money to be made because people want it. The people who are not in this environment, who are out east benefiting or paying for it, benefiting from it or paying for it. The winnings are not coming downstream here. These are subsistence wages. And that's what makes this a much more interesting criticism of the Western novel, too, because it contextualizes these characters in the actual history of the area. Cowboys were not out there doing their work because it was rustic and cool and good. They were moving cattle for people who owned them. They live within these larger systems, too, even if they don't see it, and they crush what was already there underfoot. If anything, when you talk about this novel as a deconstruction, as a criticism, I would say, yes, that is the case, but more than anything, when you read it, you begin to see the falsity of this genre because it is not interested in exploring the world as it is and how the Wild West wasn't a unique part, an offshoot in the way that Turner thinks of it, its own organism, its own environment for an organism to grow in, but one that was dependent on the larger civilizational, dependent on the other element of it. In the same way the other element was dependent on them to get something as well, to a much lesser degree, obviously, but one that knows these things are yet interlinked and is paying attention to what is lost in these narratives afterwards. And I wanted to talk about evil in this novel, but I don't know if I really have too much to say about evil. Evil is in waste. Evil is in how stupid it is. Evil is in how cruel Miller is. Evil is in how thoughtless these actions are. Brenner's quote that I took at the beginning from Wallace Stegner, our Westerners so stupid that they don't believe in evil, or so smug that they have no personal hells to descend into. For me, the more important part is the second half, those personal hells that they all begin to live in. Well, almost all. Andrews sort of resist it. Francine doesn't engage with that in the same way, but almost every other character does get to descend, lucky them, into their own personal hell. But it's not evil in the same way that you see evil in Blood Meridian. Now here's the part where we're going to compare. Blood Meridian, on the surface level, yes, deals with many of these same things, takes these trades which are so, this era which is so vaunted, so written about, so propagandized, and instead gives you bloody mayhem, murder, violence, rape. It gives you an unflinching and depiction of this time in which there is no heroism. And I wanted to talk about evil in the two, but the more I thought about it, the more I really couldn't compare them because they just don't seem, the evils of Butcher's Crossing are kind of grounded. They are the everyday evils of the system we live in now. Blood Meridian, I think the evil is found mostly not just in the characters. Yes, these Yankees who are carving a bloody path, leaving behind many, many innocents dead for the sake of profit early on and later in the novel, just because they can, because it's available to them, because no one's going to stop them. That, too, lays a pretty stark truth down at the American feet of the love for violence that this country has, the love for doing violence upon others. But I think that is almost secondary to the judge. And the judge's evil is talked about all the time. I mean, when I looked him up, I found this wiki called, was it Villain Wiki, that had the judge on there? I've seen plenty of people break it down, but the thing about when people talk about evil and place it in the judge, what strikes me is that it feels so personal. It feels, because the judge has a philosophy, but one that's still pretty opaque. The judge's nature is not revealed, although he feels supernatural in a way. His real beliefs are vague. He believes in war. His practitioner, he is insistent on writing down these, or taking descriptions of items before he destroys them, so he has the only record of them to exist. It's vague. His goals aren't clear exactly. You can extrapolate, and when I see people writing about it, or talking about it, I'm struck with the sense that they are imposing their own moral systems, what is evil in them, and attributes that to the judge, because the judge's evil is so wide that it's a big tent. It fits anything. And I didn't know how to talk about it because I didn't think I had anything to add. But as I was poking around reading, was on Reddit, I saw someone point out, hey, you should look up one of the epigraphs, Jacob Boehm, Boehme. It's the second epigraph of the novel, which let me read it. It is not to be thought that the life of darkness is sunk in the misery and lost as if in sorrowing. There is no sorrowing, for sorrow is the thing that is swallowed up in death, and death and dying are the very life of the darkness. So that comes from Jacob Boehm, who is this sort of 18th century German Christian mysticist, mystical theologian, I guess you could say, not a formally educated one, but someone who wrote quite extensively about his ideas of theology. And so you could infer that there's some influence there, although strange because Boehm is certainly not someone who's made a very large mark on the history of philosophy or theology afterwards. But clearly McCarthy had read him, at least to some degree. Now, as is pointed out in this article, the influence of Jacob Boehm's Aurora on Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, although some people have identified that epigraph as coming from Jacob Boehm's best-known work, Aurora, it is not actually from there. It's from a different tract, 6 Theosophic Points instead, which is specifically getting into sort of what the darkness, what Satan is. The author of that article, Lydia Cooper, argues there's still good reason to look at Aurora to try to understand Blood Meridian. And now, granted, I've only read the first page of this article because the full thing, I could not find it on JSTOR, and the full thing on Taylor and Francis Online is $56, and I'm not that, look, I'm willing to go to some strange places for you guys. I'm not willing to pay $56 for a 20-something page document. As Cooper points out, the full title of Aurora is Aurora, that is, the day spring, or dawning of the day in the Orient, or morning redness in the rising of the sun, which draws a parallel to the full title of Blood Meridian, which is Blood Meridian, or the Evening Redness in the West. Now, granted, surface level observation, but a compelling one all the same. After reading that and realizing that I could not get access to the article, I thought, why don't I go ahead and read Jacob Boehm's Aurora and see what I can get out of it? And boy, was that a waste of my Saturday. I got like 120-something pages in before I realized I don't think I really need to know all of the 7 essences or 14 essences which make up angels and what specifically differentiates Satan. But reading it did give me one thing which I think gives me some insight into Blood Meridian, why I think it feels very different from Butcher's Crossing. Butcher's Crossing is very much set in contextualized in the industry. Butcher's Crossing is very grounded. Its evil, like I said, is less biblical. It's financial. It's personal. It's the meanness that men do. It's what they do it for. Whereas in Blood Meridian, the overriding sense of evil it feels biblical. It's a struggle between an immortal evil, not the small personal evils of individual men. It's something that is ongoing. The judge is not just an evil person for the hell of it. The judge is acting according to some kind of rules that the judge sees as universal rules, the rules of life, if you want to call it that. And I do see the parallels with, from frankly, like the first 10 pages, which is all I really should have read instead of spending most of my Saturday reading Aurora. Jacob Boehme places the struggle between good and evil at the very foundation of his philosophy. He gives this example at the beginning of Aurora of a tree growing. A tree which produces fruit. And that tree can produce good fruit, sweet fruit, or sour fruit, small, shriveled. And to Boma, that's an example of humanity. The same tree, the tree of life, can grow both of these things. And the sap within the tree, which allows the tree to grow stronger, produce good fruit, is God. And the other factors, which can make the fruit shrivel, grow sour, coldness in the air, whatever the case may be, that's the devil. The entirety of human life is this struggle, this balance between good and evil. And that may not seem particularly revelatory if you're, I guess, familiar with Christianity. Of course, the struggle between good and evil is a pretty pivotal struggle, pretty pivotal part of the theology. But Boma's theology starts with this basically from the beginning. That is not just pivotal, that is foundational, because Boma is trying to analyze the growth of people, how to make what creates the human being. And for Boma, the very nature of humanity after the original sin is this lifelong struggle between the goodness of God and the inherent evil of the devil. And then he starts getting into a lot of really other specific stuff, which I don't really want to get into because I don't think it's that interesting. But let me read a couple quotes from Aurora here. This is sentence 74 from the preface. Quote, "Only the two qualities, good and bad, which had been made in nature, the one and the other, were separated, and the bad one was given to the prince of malice and wrath, or fierceness, for an eternal habituation, and that is called hell, or a rejection, which in eternity no more apprehends or toucheth the good quality, but is an oblivion of all good, and that to its eternity." Later on, from chapter 1, Boma goes on to elaborate a little bit more, saying, "In this consideration, there are two qualities, a good one and an evil one, which are in each other as in one thing in this world, in all powers, in the stars and the elements, also in all creatures. And no creature in flesh in the natural life can subsist unless it has the two qualities. The fact of possessing of good and evil is fundamental to life itself, and not just the life of humanity, the life of everything." I think the following sentence, Boma writes this, "Speaking of heat, which contains both light, again, quote, again, heat containeth also a fierceness, or wrath, which burneth, consumeth, and spoils. This wrath or fierceness springeth, driveth, and elevateth itself into the light, and make the light movable. Hence wrestleth and fighteth together in its twofold source as one thing. It is also one thing, but it has a double source. The light subsisteth in God without heat, but it does not subsist so in nature." In chapter 2, quote, "There is nothing in nature wherein there is not good and evil. Everything moveth and liveth in this double impulse, working or operation, be it what it will." This is something that Boma hits on repeatedly. I think this is what makes it interesting, separate from, I was raised religious. I was raised really religious, actually. And of course, that was something that came up quite often. But Boma is expanding this notion of good and evil. It's not just, it's the life, the history-long struggle between God and Satan. No, it is the basic element of life itself, of not just life, of the whole universe, because of the creation of God and the influence of the devil, which is in everything, and in every single thing, those two qualities come together. And I think also, I should point out, Boma also believes that evil exists entirely outside of God. Now, we're getting kind of technical here, but this is not also a not uncommon belief in Christianity that on one hand, you could have a view of God as truly, completely omnipotent, master of everything, in which case would naturally contain both good and evil, because evil, if this God is the master of the universe and everything, evil must be contained within that. On the other hand, I'd say more people tend to believe in some way the devil, evilness like that, is somehow separate from God, corrupted, outside, whatever the case may be. Boma falls into the second category, wherein the devil is this evilness is entirely separate from God. And he goes into a lot of argumentation for why that's the case. I'm not interested in going over it. You just need to know that's how he views things. And because all of life post Adam and Eve has the original sin passed down onto them, these two qualities exist. And to me, Blood Meridian feels like a riff on that. wherein you have the judge who is this inherently destructive force, fierceness, wrath, one that burneth, consumeth, and spoils. The judge brings nothing good. The judge brings only destruction. And it feels like there is no counterbalance in that world. It feels like an exploration. It's kind of conservative in that sense. Like, look at what happens if there's not good God to counteract these evil things. But looking at it, I want to take this line from chapter 13, which is called "Of the terrible, doleful, lamentable, miserable fall of the kingdom of Lucifer," from the ninth sentence. "Christ saith, the devil was a murderer and a liar from the beginning, and he did not stand in the truth. But seeing these justifiers and disputers assist the devil so steadfastly and pervert God's truth, and that change it into lies, in that they make of God a thirsty and fierce and wrathful devil, and such as one as he created and still willeth evil, so all of them, together with the devil jointly, murderers and liars. And so are such writers and scribblers, the master builders of lies and damnation, who help to confirm and establish the devil's lies and make of the merciful, loving, and friendly God a murderer and furious destroyer, and so pervert and turn the truth of God into lies." And then a little further onward, "But Lucifer intended by that means to be above God. None could domineer and rule so terribly as he himself. All must stoop to him. He would, with his spirit in the whole deity, rule as a powerful king over all. Seeing he was the fairest and most beautiful, he would also need to be the most potent." That sounds very much like the judge to me. First of all, murderer and liar from the beginning. The very first thing we see the judge do in Blood Meridian is tell a lie that leads to a man's murder. And the judge feels that he needs to be a master over all things, that he is the most potent by engaging in this act of war. As we talked about at the very beginning of this episode, he proves that he is better. He plays the ultimate game, the game of proving domination. Because in war, as he says, the ultimate game, there can only be one victory or destruction. That sounds a lot like how Lucifer's portrayed in this. I don't want to do a full analysis again. I gave up on this after 120 pages because it got the heat example I gave for, by the way, that was like one of 30 examples, which is basically saying the same thing. So it got really repetitive and I got tired of it, but I think it did help me understand Blood Meridian in a work which is genuinely portraying Satan as Boma sees it. In a way, this creature which seeks only to domineer, which has no counterbalance. There is no good and evil in the judge. There's just evil, like Satan and Boma. One that must domineer. The judge doesn't just appreciate things. The judge makes sure that he is the only record of it. He becomes the master of its memory. And I guess the only thing I have to contribute is when I described Blood Meridian as primordial evil, I guess it makes sense because it feels like it's really ripping off this mystical Christian theology, this exploration of an evil which is eternal. The evil in Butcher's Crossing is very relevant to its time and place, whereas the evil in Blood Meridian is, of course, set within a particular time period, but one which exists before and after it. It is not relevant to the context of its period. The evil of the judge is not related to production somewhere out east. It's not related to a profit incentive. It's related to a desire for domination. And I don't know if that brings too much more illumination to Blood Meridian. There are many more people who can talk way more intelligently than I can. But to me, that is like the essential reason why these books are not comparable in a meaningful way beyond just sharing some base characteristics of being critical of how Westerns have been done before or going their own way on the matter. One is very aware of context. The other is not so concerned with context. The other is concerned with eternal questions. And so when I ask, so what? When you compare these two things, so what does that mean? I think these two books are just share a genre. And they go completely different directions with it in every meaningful way. So I guess the long way, the now an hour and a half in to recording this, when I say I don't think you should compare the two, it's that simple thing I said at the beginning, that when you get down into the technicals, into the specifics, it just doesn't line up as neatly, and I just have to ask, why do you need to compare the two? These two sit in their own way pretty nicely. They are going their own direction, they're dealing with their own questions, and frankly, their questions don't overlap much. At least in my mind. Maybe there's someone who's read both these things and has read Emerson and has read Aurora and has a different perspective on it, coming away from it. But sitting where I am now, one, I think you should read Butcher's Crossing. Two, maybe read Blood Meridian. I don't really know if I can actually recommend Blood Meridian, both because of the content of the book and also if you know anything about Cormac McCarthy's personal life. I think you could say McCarthy was bad, not good. Pretty... If I were to say he's questionable, you could easily accuse me of, frankly, covering for him, because questionable is generous to the nth degree. Straight up wrong to do a lot of the things that we know he did, even though the way, at least the story that was told of him keeping in contact and traveling with this teenager, I don't think the story was told particularly well. You can look at that and say, okay, that is indisputably wrong, perverted. I'm still interested in McCarthy because I think in many ways some of his books are dealing with that, actually, in the context of knowing that he was bringing the 16-year-old along to travel with him when he was, away from his family. Makes that scene at the end of No Country for Old Men where Llewellyn Moss is killed when he's sitting with a teenager, and everyone thinks that he was had run off with a teenager, so to speak. You can't really run off with a teenager; it's rape, but that's not actually what happened. And the sheriff says he suspects that was all not the case, and that's what he tells his wife. It's kind of hard not to see McCarthy's own experience. That actually makes it a little bit more fascinating to me. Having this novel, which is otherwise not really about that, have a preemptive sort of absolution for this character for being in this situation which was not the same as McCarthy's, but if you squint and rewrite it in the most charitable way possible, could have been the same. That makes that more interesting. So, I don't really know if I can recommend Blood Meridian. If you feel up to it, I guess read it. And then third of all, if you're going to make a comparison, be pretty certain what exactly it is makes them comparable and why you're making it, and have an answer for so what. Gosh, sorry. I feel like this episode is really kind of meandering all over the place. Usually I like to have a big idea I want to address, but I don't have that here. I enjoyed reading Butcher's Crossing. I think you should read it. I thought it was a lot of fun, and I will leave it there because it's been long enough. Before I let you go, I just wanted to tell you what we're doing next time, which is actually doing Sasha Sokolov's Between Dog and Wolf. This time I really mean it. We're going to get there. We're working with the schedule we got, not the one we wish we had. But thank you for listening. And if you want to help keep the podcast independent, you can head on over to slaviclitpod.com. That's where you can find ways to show support through financial means if you have the ability to do so. It helps me keep the lights on around here. For everyone who already supports the podcast financially, thank you. The music used, as always, was Staraya Kino of Hiramotka. You'll hear from me again soon.